January 31, 1945. The war in the Pacific was nearing its brutal end. At the captured Clark Air Base in the Philippines, the roar of American engines had replaced the thunder of Japanese bombers. Among the wreckage of hangars and shattered runways stood something extraordinary. A fully intact Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, abandoned by its crew in perfect condition. Its tail read 76312, and its silver-green fuselage gleamed eerily under the tropical sun. Major Frank T. McCoy, commander of the Technical Air Intelligence Unit, stepped closer with his inspection team. What they were about to discover would reveal one of the greatest paradoxes of the Pacific War. How Japan built one of the most far-ranging bombers in history, but also one of the deadliest for its own pilots. The aircraft loomed before them like a sleeping giant, streamlined, graceful, almost beautiful. Its twin 14-cylinder radial engines, Nakajima Sakai 21s, could each produce nearly 1,500 horsepower. Its wings stretched almost 25 meters across, with a narrow fuselage built for speed and range. But to McCoy's trained eyes, something was strange. The bomber's skin seemed thin, unnervingly thin, its frame almost fragile. He climbed up onto the left wing, removed an inspection panel, and froze. Inside were vast fuel tanks, enormous, gleaming, and completely unprotected. No armor, no self-sealing lining. Just bare aluminum walls separating thousands of liters of aviation fuel from open air. It was a revelation that stunned McCoy's entire team. For years, Allied pilots had noticed the same terrifying pattern. Every time a Betty was hit, it burst into flames instantly. Fighters called it the flying cigar, the flying lighter, or the one-shot bomb. Now the mystery was solved. This wasn't a flaw. It was deliberate. Mitsubishi's engineers had designed the G4M under one uncompromising order from the Imperial Japanese Navy: build a bomber with unmatched range, able to strike anywhere across the Pacific without relying on aircraft carriers. Every kilogram mattered. Armor and self-sealing tanks were considered unnecessary weight. Range was everything. Protection was a luxury Japan believed it could sacrifice. McCoy realized the full meaning of that decision as he photographed the bomber's wing structure and interior. This machine had not failed its mission. It had fulfilled its purpose perfectly, just not in the way its pilots had hoped. Its very design had doomed them from the start. Looking across the airfield, McCoy could still see the scars from December 8, 1941, when these same bombers had struck Clark Field in one of the first blows of the Pacific War. Back then, dozens of American aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. The Betty had once been Japan's symbol of dominance. Now standing silent and abandoned, it had become a monument to the fatal flaw of that ambition. In the sweltering Philippine heat, McCoy snapped one final photo. It captured not just an airplane, but the story of a design philosophy that traded survival for speed and range for the lives of thousands of men. The investigation of tail number 763-12 had just begun, and it would uncover the most haunting truth of Japan's air war. The story of the Mitsubishi G4M Betty began long before that wreck was found in the Philippines. In 1937, as the Empire of Japan looked toward conquest across the Pacific, the Imperial Navy issued a bold demand. They wanted a land-based bomber that could reach 3,000 miles, strike deep into enemy territory, and return home without refueling. No other nation had such a machine. It would have to outrange, outpace, and outperform anything the world had ever seen. At the Mitsubishi plant in Nagoya, a brilliant but tormented engineer named Kiro Honjo was given the task. He understood what the Navy wanted: a bomber that could fly from Japan to the Philippines, from Rabaul to Darwin, from Saipan to Pearl Harbor, all without relying on aircraft carriers. But he also knew such performance came at a price. To achieve it, Honjo made the boldest design decision of his life: to strip away every ounce of weight that wasn't absolutely necessary. The G4M would have no armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no bulletproof glass. Every gram would go to speed and range. Its sleek, cigar-shaped fuselage was designed with aerodynamic perfection, tapering sharply at the tail to reduce drag. The result was a plane that could cruise at over 250 miles per hour and carry a torpedo or a full bomb load over incredible distances. When the prototype first took flight in 1939, Navy observers were stunned. The G4M soared effortlessly, its range nearly double that of any Western bomber of the time. It was exactly what the admirals had ordered: fast, long-legged, and deadly. They named it simply Type 1 land-based attack aircraft. The pilots called it Ishikiran Dani, one shot will kill. That nickname would prove darkly prophetic. Early in the war, the Betty seemed unstoppable. She had struck with terrifying precision during the invasions of the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Its long range allowed Japan to attack Allied bases that believed themselves far out of reach. When Admiral Yamamoto ordered the attack on Rabaul and Darwin, it was the G4M that carried the bombs. But behind every success, there was a growing unease among the crews. They had seen what happened when one bullet hit the fuel tanks. The plane erupted into a fireball, and there was no time to escape. Yet orders were orders. Range was still considered more valuable than armor. The Navy believed speed was the best defense. For a time it was. But when the Allies adapted, when radar, faster fighters, and better tactics entered the skies, the Betty's weakness became fatal. Honjo himself was heartbroken. He had built a masterpiece of engineering, yet one that consumed its own pilots in flames. By 1942, whispers began circulating among the crews. The Betty will take you far, but never bring you home. In Tokyo, the designers pressed on, modifying, improving, trying to make her safer. But it was too late. The war had changed, and so had the skies. The flying cigar's beauty was becoming its curse. By early 1942, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty had already carved its name into the Pacific. From the South China Sea to the Coral Islands, its long, slender shape became a symbol of Japanese dominance in the air. The Allies feared its reach, for the Betty could appear out of nowhere, striking distant bases, convoys, and ships with the precision of a spear hurled across the ocean. Yet inside the very heart of this elegant machine lay its secret flaw, a vulnerability that would soon turn triumph into tragedy. The design that made the G4M so fast and far-reaching also made it a flying coffin. Its immense fuel tanks, unprotected and stretched across the wings, were filled with high-octane gasoline. The slightest puncture could ignite an inferno. A burst from a machine gun or a spark from flak was enough to transform the aircraft into a ball of fire streaking toward the sea. Still, in the opening months of the Pacific War, Japanese pilots had reason to believe in their aircraft. The Betty's range allowed it to strike where no other bomber could reach, and its crews carried out attacks that stunned the world. On December 10, 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor, Betty bombers based in Indochina launched a daring raid that sank two British capital ships, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. It was the first time in history that battleships had been sunk by aircraft while underway, and it sent shockwaves through the Royal Navy. For Japan, it was a validation of the bomber's design. Speed and range had conquered might and armor. The pilots who returned from that mission were hailed as heroes, their aircraft revered as the blade of Japan's new empire. But victories often hide the seeds of future defeat. As months passed, the Allied response evolved. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps adapted their tactics, intercepting the slow and steady formations of Betty bombers with agile fighters like the F-4F Wildcat and later the F-6F Hellcat. The Betty's lack of armor made it an easy target. Pilots learned to dive in from above or attack from the rear, where the bomber's defensive guns could not reach. Entire squadrons of Bettys were wiped out in a single engagement. Yet to their credit, Japanese crews never wavered. They flew with discipline and courage, knowing full well what a single hit could mean. Survivors would later recall watching their comrades' planes burst into flames, the night sky lit by burning fuel, the sea below dotted with wreckage. Still, they flew the next mission, often with quiet acceptance that they might not return. Engineers at Mitsubishi scrambled to improve the aircraft, adding armor to critical areas, experimenting with self-sealing tanks. But Japan's industrial base was stretched thin, and the G4M continued to roll off the lines much as it had from the beginning, fast, fragile, and fatally flawed. By mid-1943, the Allies had begun to call it the Flying Lighter. American pilots, after shooting one down, described it as exploding like a torch soaked in gasoline. The Betty's fiery demise became one of the most haunting images of the Pacific Air War. Yet despite the danger, Japanese squadrons kept flying, believing that the sacrifice of one bomber might mean victory for the Empire. In those burning skies, courage clashed with inevitability, and the fate of the Betty was sealed by the very brilliance that had once made it soar. In the summer of 1943, amidst the wreckage-strewn jungles of Guadalcanal, fate delivered the Allies a prize that would change their understanding of Japanese air power. For months, U.S. forces had fought tooth and nail to claim the island, every ridge, airstrip, and coconut grove soaked in blood. But as the tide began to turn, American patrols stumbled upon the remains of something extraordinary, an intact Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber. Unlike most that went down in flames, this one had crash-landed with surprising grace. Its crew, mortally wounded or captured, left behind a nearly complete machine, one that could finally reveal the secrets of Japan's most feared long-range bomber. The aircraft's sleek fuselage, olive green and sun-faded, still bore the red Hinomaru roundels of the Imperial Navy. Marines who first approached it were astonished at its condition. Bullet holes stitched its tail, the engines were seized and one wing was crumpled, yet the structure remained mostly intact. Engineers were soon called in to examine what remained, their excitement palpable. They had fought against these aircraft for more than a year, but never had the Allies captured one so complete. Within days, the wreckage was carefully dismantled, crated and shipped to the rear for study. At Allied technical intelligence centers, mechanics and pilots alike gathered around the salvaged Betty with fascination and disbelief. They examined its construction, the lightweight aluminum skin so thin it could be pierced by a screwdriver, the unprotected fuel tanks that stretched like liquid bombs beneath the wings. For all its elegance and aerodynamic efficiency, the aircraft's design seemed to defy logic. "This thing shouldn't even fly, let alone reach 2,000 miles, one U.S. officer reportedly remarked, shaking his head. Yet the captured bomber also revealed genius within its fragility. Engineers noted the remarkable precision of its assembly, the clever weight-saving techniques, and the aerodynamic shaping that gave it unmatched range. Mitsubishi's design philosophy was clear: sacrifice survivability for speed and endurance. Every inch of the Betty was built for efficiency. Its two Mitsubishi Kase engines, each delivering 1,530 horsepower, were mounted with minimal armor to save weight. Its fuselage was stretched to maximize internal fuel storage, and its wings were built with an almost glider-like slenderness. The discovery helped Allied strategists understand not only the aircraft, but the mindset behind Japan's military design, one rooted in offense, mobility, and calculated risk. The captured Betty was soon transported to Allied airfields in Australia, where it underwent full restoration for flight testing. Pilots from the Technical Air Intelligence Unit, TAIU, inspected every control surface, each rivet and seam. They marveled at the aircraft's smooth handling at low speeds and its ability to cover distances that most Allied bombers couldn't. But the verdict was damning. It was a beautiful, deadly death trap. In test flights, the Betty's fuel system proved so volatile that even a minor leak could lead to explosion. Ground crews worked in fear each time the engine started. American engineers recorded every finding, preparing manuals and briefings for combat pilots across the Pacific. Knowledge was power, and this wrecked Japanese bomber was about to become one of the most valuable sources of intelligence in the entire war. When the first reports reached Admiral Nimitz's command, the conclusion was blunt: the enemy builds for range, not for survival. From that day forward, U.S. pilots would exploit this fatal flaw. The next time they faced the G4M in battle, they knew exactly where to aim. What began as a chance discovery in the sweltering jungles of Guadalcanal became a turning point in the air war, a moment when the Allies finally understood what made Japan's wings so powerful and so vulnerable. When the captured Betty finally arrived at the Allied test facility in Australia, it was treated with almost surgical reverence. Mechanics and intelligence officers, some of the best in the Pacific theater, descended upon the aircraft like archaeologists at a sacred site. What they found inside stunned them. The cockpit was spacious compared to American bombers, designed for long missions over endless seas. Instruments were neatly arranged, though labeled in Japanese script. But what caught their attention most was the thinness of everything: the skin, the wiring, the insulation. The bomber seemed more like a model aircraft than a combat machine. Every plate of aluminum was wafer-thin, almost translucent under sunlight. The absence of armor baffled the engineers. No steel reinforcement behind the pilot's seat. No protective bulkheads around the fuel system. It was clear now why American gunners often reported seeing Bettys explode in mid-air after just a few hits. The bomber carried its death within it. Fuel tanks, large and unprotected, were located directly in the wings. Massive bladders of aviation gasoline. A single tracer round could ignite them instantly. As one U.S. pilot later described, it didn't take much, just a spark, and the whole bird turned into a torch in the sky. Yet despite this fatal flaw, the engineers could not deny the brilliance of the design. The Betty was astonishingly light, built for range and endurance above all else. Japanese engineers had stripped away every ounce of unnecessary weight. Even the landing gear was delicate, designed for airstrips of coral or hard-packed sand, not rugged terrain. The Mitsubishi G4M radial engines, each producing over 1,500 horsepower, gave the bomber exceptional speed for its size, nearly 270 miles per hour at cruising altitude. Combined with the aircraft's sleek aerodynamics, this made it one of the longest-range bombers of the war. In the early years, this gave Japan an advantage that stunned the Allies. The Betty could strike distant targets and retreat before enemy fighters could intercept. That advantage explained why the G4M became the backbone of Japan's early Pacific campaigns, carrying out daring missions from the Philippines to the Indian Ocean. But as the test reports continued, admiration turned to disbelief. The radio compartment, though efficient, was built with no shielding. A single burst of shrapnel could cut communications instantly. The tail gunner's position, enclosed in glass, was completely unarmored, offering an open invitation to enemy fighters. Even the crew's emergency exits were poorly placed, leaving little chance of survival once the plane caught fire. U.S. intelligence analysts began to grasp the philosophy behind it. The Japanese didn't design their planes to survive hits. They designed them not to be hit at all. It was an ethos born of desperation and daring, a belief that skill and sacrifice could compensate for lack of protection. Reports of kamikaze tactics that emerged later in the war would echo this same fatal logic. As the Betty's internal systems were mapped and studied, American test pilots prepared for the first flight under Allied colors. The fuselage was repainted with U.S. markings, though the red circles beneath the new insignia still faintly showed through. When the engines roared to life for the first time, the ground crew stood in tense silence. Flames licked from the exhaust stacks, and the sound of the twin casses filled the airfield, a low, guttural growl that seemed both beautiful and ominous. The Betty rose gracefully into the sky. From a distance it looked untouchable, but every man watching knew. One spark, one bullet, one unlucky hit, and it would be gone in seconds. It was a paradox of Japanese engineering, an aircraft that embodied brilliance and fragility in equal measure. And as American analysts soon realized, that paradox would cost Japan dearly in the battles yet to come. The death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, was one of the most remarkable air operations of the Second World War, and the Betty bomber was at the center of it. American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii intercepted a top-secret Japanese transmission. The message detailed Yamamoto's upcoming inspection tour across the Solomon Islands on April 18, 1943, including the precise time and flight route. It was the break the Allies had been waiting for. The U.S. planned an interception so daring, it bordered on impossible. 16 P-38 Lightning fighters were chosen for the mission because of their extraordinary range, the only American fighters capable of covering the 1,000-mile round trip. The plan required flawless timing. The P-38s would fly over open ocean for hours at wave-top height to avoid radar detection, arrive exactly at the calculated intercept point, and strike within seconds of Yamamoto's approach. Any error would doom the mission. At 07:25, the P-38s took off from Guadalcanal, flying barely 50 feet above the waves, radio silent. After more than 2 hours, they reached the intercept zone, precisely on schedule. At 09:34, spotters saw 2 Betty bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber broke formation to engage. Barber's guns locked onto the lead bomber, Yamamoto's aircraft. Tracer rounds ripped through the wings, hitting the unprotected fuel tanks. Flames erupted instantly. The bomber rolled to the right, plunged into the jungle below and exploded in a fireball. The second Betty was also destroyed moments later. Yamamoto's death was confirmed the next day. It was a stunning blow to Japan's morale and a triumphant moment for American intelligence and precision planning. Yet the mission also exposed the catastrophic weakness of the Betty itself. The unprotected fuel tanks, meant to preserve range, turned it into a death trap. Even minor hits became fatal. For the Americans, Operation Vengeance became a legend of calculated precision. For Japan, it was a tragedy born from design arrogance. The very bomber built to carry its greatest admiral across vast distances had instead carried him to his death. By 1945, the once proud Betty squadrons were little more than remnants of Japan's early war air power. Outclassed by American Hellcats and Corsairs, their vulnerability had become infamous. Yet even as the tide turned, the Japanese military continued to rely on the G4M's exceptional range for one last, desperate strategy: the kamikaze missions. The Betty became a carrier for a new weapon, the MXY-7 Oka, or Cherry Blossom, a rocket-powered suicide aircraft designed to strike Allied ships. On March 21, 1945, 18 Betty bombers departed from Kanoya Air Base, each carrying an Oka slung beneath its belly. Their mission was to reach American naval forces near Okinawa, release the rocket planes within 20 kilometers, and let the pilots dive into enemy vessels. But the mission demanded the impossible. The Bettys had to survive long enough to reach release range. Loaded with the heavy Oka, they were slower and even more defenseless than usual. American radar detected them 100 miles out. Within minutes, F-6F Hellcats from the USS Hornet intercepted. What followed was annihilation. The slow, lumbering Bettys were torn apart in the air. One by one, they ignited in great orange blossoms of flame, their fuel tanks exploding on impact. Not a single bomber survived. Not a single Oka was launched. 137 crewmen and 15 Oka pilots perished in a matter of minutes. It was the purest example of the Betty's fatal contradiction. A bomber that could fly farther than any other, but could not survive contact with the enemy. The Japanese command called it noble sacrifice. The pilots called it inevitability. To the Americans who witnessed the flaming wrecks falling into the sea, it was simply tragic. 4 days after Japan's surrender, on August 19, 1945, 2 Betty bombers took to the skies for one last flight. But these were not bombers of war. They were painted white, adorned with green crosses, and carried no weapons. Their call signs were Baton 1 and Baton 2. Inside sat the Japanese delegation, traveling to meet Allied representatives to discuss the terms of surrender. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The same aircraft that had unleashed destruction at Clark Field in the Philippines in 1941 was now a vessel of submission. Piloted by Lieutenant Den Sudo, one of the aircraft was a converted G6M transport variant, stripped of armament and fitted with seats for diplomats. The 2 Bettys took off from Atsugi Airfield and flew toward Hiroshima, escorted by American fighters to ensure they stayed on course. Below them lay a Pacific Ocean, littered with the wreckage of their fallen comrades. As the white bombers touched down safely on Hirošima's runway, cameras captured the moment. The war that had begun with roaring engines and blazing bombs now ended in quiet surrender. The circle was complete. The Betty had become a ghost of its former self, a symbol of Japan's lost empire and the staggering cost of ambition without protection. By the war's end, Mitsubishi had produced approximately 2,414 Betty bombers. It was among the most numerous aircraft in Japan's arsenal, second only to fighter planes. Yet despite its impressive production, barely a handful survived the conflict. The G4M's loss rate was staggering, so high that some squadrons reported replacement cycles of mere weeks. Out of every 100 bombers built, nearly all were destroyed in combat. The Model 1, built from 1941 to 1943, offered speed and range unmatched by any Allied bomber of its size, over 3,700 miles. But its fuel tanks, holding nearly 5,000 liters of gasoline without self-sealing protection, made it a flying bomb. Later models, such as the G4M2 and G4M3, improved performance and finally introduced self-sealing tanks, but far too late. Only around 90 of the final version were ever produced, before Japan's industry collapsed under relentless bombing. The Betty's thin skin and unarmored design had made sense in 1937, when Japan expected short wars and limited opposition. But by 1943, against radar-guided long-range Allied fighters, that philosophy became suicide. Thousands of Japanese airmen paid the price for their engineers' trade-offs. Survivors described missions where they watched entire formations vanish in fireballs within minutes. One pilot said, "We flew with courage," but courage could not stop fire. The Betty's production numbers tell the story of ambition turned tragedy, a weapon that achieved everything it promised on paper, but failed where it mattered most. Survival. The story of the Betty bomber is not just about metal, fuel, and fire. It is a study in philosophy and human cost. When American engineers examined the captured G4M at Clark Field in 1945, they realized it was not a poorly designed plane. It was a brilliantly designed machine built around fatal assumptions. Japan's engineers had sacrificed protection for performance, believing that speed and range would ensure success. But in the end, war punished such faith. The Allies built bombers that brought their crews home. Japan built bombers that sent theirs to certain death. The Betty's unprotected fuel tanks became symbols of that difference. They were not a mistake, they were a decision. And that decision turned every mission into a gamble between success and fiery oblivion. From the skies over Guadalcanal to the jungles of Bougainville, from the burning seas of Okinawa to the white-painted surrender plains over Ishima, the Betty's journey traced the rise and fall of Imperial Japan's air power. It began as a weapon of dominance and ended as a vessel of surrender. Its legacy lives not in the number of targets it destroyed, but in the lessons it left behind. That range means nothing if you cannot return. That power without protection is self-destruction, and that even the most advanced machines cannot defy the realities of war. The Betty bomber, sleek, fast and doomed, remains a haunting reminder that in the skies of World War II, brilliance often burned brightest just before it vanished into flame.